Greetings everybody, participants at this Jack Human Conservation Agriculture Day. And it's my pleasure to speak to you today about the SmartAgri Plan and a little bit about the history of it, implementation and the way forward. So before I launch into the presentation, just a few principles that have been adopted by the national government, the provincial government and also by this department as we try to devise a response to climate change. And I think it's important to bring these up front. And it's just something to think about as I take you through the presentation. The first is that climate change is not something for the future. It is already happening. We're in the midst of it. It's not something that we're going to only maybe experience in 10 or 20 or 50 years. And so it is now basically a crisis. And many countries around the world have actually officially termed it a global crisis. And it's now really urgent that we need to respond to it. So one of the first principles is that we really have to transition to what we call net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, absolutely latest. We have to do that in order to reduce the warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and to avert catastrophic climate extremes. The second thing is that we absolutely have to invest in our natural capital to reduce climate risks and impacts. And we do this through restoration and regeneration of our landscapes, of our soils, our water, and so on. The other thing is that economic growth is an absolute imperative in this country, and so is job creation. But we must make sure that we do this in a way that is climate-proof. Then, very, very important, in this country where we have very many poor people, we must make sure that vulnerable people are protected. So who is going to respond? Who is going to lead this? And it's important to say that, yes, government must show leadership in this through governance, good governance, through planning, but we can only do this in partnership with the sector, with the agriculture sector, with farmers, with the value chain, and take it forward like this. All right, so the overview of the presentation, I'm going to start with a brief update on climate change, what's happening with the global and the local level. Then I'm going to just briefly come back to what the SmartAgri Plan was, how it was developed, and also its implementation phase until now. Then there was an evaluation done of the SmartAgri Plan. I'm going to go through that and the response to the recommendations. And then lastly, the way forward for deeper implementation of the plan for more impact, and then specifically looking at conservation agriculture and its role in the SmartAgri Plan. So first of all, here is two figures that show what's happening globally in a very average, very broad way. In the top left figure, we can see how the Earth has been warming globally. This is both land and ocean surface temperature. And we can see that there's a relentless rise that is continuing. But we also see that this warming is not the same everywhere in the world, and that is where the map at the bottom comes in. We can see that the Arctic area, the tundra, the Siberia certainly are showing the most rapid warming. But there are other areas, and Southern Africa is amongst those areas that are also showing very significant warming. Then where are we heading to? What do we know about the modeling or the projections of where what is the maximum warming that we will end up with by the end of the century? And it's important to just remind people here that the Paris Agreement, which I think everybody knows about, the long-term goal there is to keep global warming to below or well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and then to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Where are we currently? Well, currently we're at 1.2 degrees Celsius. So we don't have a lot of time before we get to 1.5, and then we've missed the opportunity to take steps that will keep us below harmful levels of warming. So we can see here in this figure that the arrow pointing to the blue block there, current policies, government policies around the world, when all of those are brought together, we can see that if that is what we're going to do, we are actually going to go for 3 degrees Celsius. The most optimistic pledges that have been made, and those are just pledges that are not being implemented yet, but the pledges might take us to 2 degrees Celsius. So it doesn't look very optimistic to stay below 1.5, but it's still something we have to strive for. All right, what is the Western Cape prognosis? What does the future look like in this part of the country? So Locally important climate systems will be changing. So we're seeing a southward or a poleward shift of our westerly winds, or what we call the frontal systems that bring the rain in the winter, and few of those making landfall in future. Then projected changes in rainfall are much more uncertain than for temperature, and that's really important to bear in mind as I go through this presentation. For temperature, the models are pretty much in agreement. For rainfall, not so much. And so we can only say possibly this or possibly that, so we must be very careful not to overinterpret the rainfall changes or the projections. There is scientific consensus, though, to a large part, that generally in the longer term, the Western Cape is likely to become drier with more droughts, more dry spells, and we see this will be as the climate system adjusts over the next few decades. But what is important is that in the next few, maybe 20, 30 years, these trends will start emerging, but they will make themselves felt, especially in agriculture, more as increasing interannual and intraannual variability of rainfall and temperature. So not being able to predict climate anymore, or weather systems, and very erratic weather systems, or things that have never happened before, those kinds of situations are going to become more and more common, and more frequent severe weather as well. If we look at the modeled annual temperature increases for the Western Cape, and this is the median of 6 different climate models, we can see that in general we're looking at about 1.5 to 3 degrees Celsius warming by the middle of the century, with the lower end of that warming along the coast and the higher end going up to 3 degrees Celsius in the inland areas of the Karoo. We also expect more hot days and nights and fewer cold days and nights. And if we look at the warming that we are experiencing and that will continue into the future, this will obviously also affect evapotranspiration, and that's really important for farmers. And the modeling shows that annual or reference potential evaporation is likely to increase by about 70 to 120 millimeters in most of the agricultural areas of the Western Cape. So it means that soils are going to dry out more quickly. Plants will need to have inputs of water more often, perhaps through irrigation, to maintain their water relations and their productivity. If we look at rainfall, as I said, we must be very careful with these projections because there are always some models that don't agree with this. But in general, we're looking at reductions in winter rainfall specifically. And certainly there seems to be more agreement on the western side of the province, so the west coast, that we'll see some drying there. More high likelihood of droughts as well, and longer dry spells. We might see some changes along the mountain ranges, where we have a little bit of increasing rainfall for a while, maybe on some of the mountain ranges, and also going towards the eastern side of the province. In the summer rainfall areas, we could see more thunderstorm activity and a bit more rainfall there in future. That's shown by the blue areas on this map. All right, but what is clear, and that's already shown that it's already happening, is that rainfall is coming in more intense events. So fewer rain days, but when the rain falls, it's more intense. All right, let's get to the SmartAgri Plan. This was developed from 2014 to 2016. It is the Western Cape Climate Change Response Framework and Implementation Plan specifically for the agricultural sector. It was a joint initiative between the Western Cape Department of Agriculture and our sister department, Environmental Affairs and Development Planning. And it really provides a roadmap to ensuring a low-carbon or climate-resilient agricultural sector in the Western Cape in the future. From 2016 to 2020, various initiatives were taken for implementation. For example, there was support to the provincial drought response in 2016, 2017 at the height of the drought. There was an embedding of climate smart agriculture in the Western Cape Department of Agriculture, its projects, its programs, and in the sector as well in many areas. Various technologies and tools have become available to help farmers make decisions or get better information on climate change in their particular area. Then there was a weekly radio program, Die Kooksteeg, which many people would be aware of, that ran for 2 years and now has been summarized in a booklet form in 3 different languages. We have the quarterly newsletter, the SmartAgri Barometer, which comes out every quarter. And then implementation of the priority projects. And important to note is one of these priority projects is conservation agriculture. It's the first one. because it was seen to be such an important response or climate smart response in agriculture in the Western Cape. Then in 2020, the department decided to evaluate or do an external evaluation of the SmartAgri Plan, the plan itself, and also the implementation of the plan. To find out, is it still relevant? Is the design still relevant? To what extent have its stated outcomes been achieved to date? Is the sector demonstrating greater resilience as a result of the implementation of the plan? And how will the plan and its implementation be strengthened going forward? This report came out in June 2020, and we're now working carefully through the recommendations and devising initiatives to respond to these recommendations. So what are the key findings? This is just a very short summary to highlight some of the key findings of this evaluation. So despite a very thorough sectoral consultation and awareness raising during the development of the plan and also afterwards, there is still a lack of awareness or knowledge of the plan and its details among key stakeholder groups. Then also, while there is evidence that there is institutionalization of the plan within the Western Cape Department of Agriculture and also within DEDP, there are certainly areas that remain that can be strengthened. So there are some areas of greater or better implementation and others that are much weaker. And so we need to make sure that we are strengthening the plan throughout, even those areas that haven't had enough attention yet. And so if I can just come to the 7 recommendations, a very short summary of what we're planning to do for each of those. So the first 2 recommendations revolve around the plan itself. The first thing we've done, that was recommendation 1, is to commission the updating of the climate change science, which is now out of date. When the plan was written, the science was that the knowledge in year 2014, basically 2015. So we are expecting the update of the science later in 2021. And following that, we will look at the update of the science and see, are there any areas that need to be adjusted, any gaps or any areas of the plan where we think the impacts have been underestimated possibly, or new impacts are emerging as risks, and that we need to bring into an update of the plan. So that will be happening in the next year or so, that we are going to inform ourselves scientifically in a way that can help us to then update the plan and all its supporting resources. That's the first thing. Then the second thing is that recommendations 3 and 4 are very much around the implementation within government. So one of the recommendations was to institute and mandate and resource a formalized SmartAgri Plan management or oversight structure. And then secondly, to undertake a deep dive review of each program in the departments, mainly the Department of Agriculture, but also with some assistance from DEDP, to assess levels of adoption of the SmartAgri Plan and drive towards institutionalization within each department's programs. So as part of these 2 recommendations, I was appointed early this year as the Scientist for Climate Change and Risk Assessment in the Department of Agriculture. And so this is the start of responding to this need for an oversight unit or structure and resources and people who can drive forward the SmartAgri Plan over the next few years. And then I'm coming to number 6 and 7, which takes us right down to farm level. Number 6 is the sector and its institutions and the value chain, for example, and 7 is farmers. So we need to re-engage, and we're already starting this process of re-engaging with sectoral organizations that are representative of the diversity of the sector in all the different parts of the province and the different commodities, and then also to re-engage with farmers themselves. And so we want to capture climate change adaptation or mitigation innovations, things that farmers are doing, learning that has been happening, for example, the learning that came from the 2015 to 2018 drought. What have farmers tried and tested, and what has been working for them to try and make themselves more climate resilient. And then we want to support information and coordination needs. So where the sector has information needs, we really want to hear about that. And then to also monitor implementation and the impact that the plan is having on making the sector more resilient. All right. One of the important things I think for this audience, listeners that are listening to my presentation now, is what about conservation agriculture? And as I said, conservation agriculture is a priority project, and there is a very detailed write-up of the planned or the proposed activities back in 2016 that we proposed in the plan in terms of rolling out conservation agriculture across the province. And so this is a slide that summarizes these activities. I'm not going to go through each of them in detail. They are available in the plan for those people who want to go and look at the detail. But many of these, I could say, are already being implemented. There's been a lot of progress already on many of, for example, the long-term CA trials that are being done at various research farms of the department, looking at mixed crop and livestock conservation agriculture, looking at what are the climatic benefits or the benefits to becoming more resilient to climate change of using conservation agriculture, and so on. And so we are going to go back to this list in detail and discuss with key role players within the department and also within the conservation agriculture group, which of these are already going very well, which of these need to be updated possibly, or where there are possibly gaps, or some which are maybe not that relevant anymore. So we're going to look at this in much more detail and speak to people and see, assess how this particular activity, this priority project, is going in terms of providing climate resilience. So as I said, this is already being driven by the Department of Agriculture, and specifically the Program Research and Technology Development Services, and also the Conservation Agriculture in the Western Cape group. So they are already running with this, and the idea is to continue with the programming and to support that from a climate change point of view. As I said, it is a priority project, and we're going to go through all those steps that I mentioned before to conduct an internal review of this particular project, to re-engage and strengthen uptake by industry organizations and role players, and then to adopt mechanisms to identify and mainstream farm-level innovation, learning, and change. So I'm looking forward to doing all of that in the next few months and over the next year or so. And then I think just to close off, there are a few things that have emerged more recently that I'd like to highlight that are very exciting, I think, in the space of conservation agriculture, and also provide a lot of new opportunities for farmers in this regard. So the first one is this very heightened interest now around soil carbon sequestration and how conservation agriculture can help us to rebuild the soil, the carbon in our soils, to build soil health and to make soils more resilient, but at the same time also sucking in the carbon dioxide, which reduces over the long term globally. If we do this over large areas, it will reduce the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and make sure that climate change does not become as serious as we think it could become. So farmers play a very big role potentially in bringing down the CO2 concentrations by using practices such as conservation agriculture. And there are now incentives, or actually financial incentives, available to farmers based on the carbon tax that has become or been implemented in South Africa, and also carbon credits where farmers can actually earn an income from good land management practices. The other thing is also on the mitigation side, so reducing carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. There's now a big drive to start that transition to using renewable energy as these become more cost effective, and specifically on farms, we need to start looking at alternative fuels other than diesel and petrol, and also the new tractors that are becoming available, for example, electric vehicles that can play a really good, important part in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also becoming much more cost effective over time. And then lastly, we need to incentivize conservation agriculture as a proactive risk reduction approach. And there is already evidence that it is a risk reduction approach that really works well, but we need more evidence and we need more testing of this side of the benefits of conservation agriculture. Thank you very much. And I welcome any communications. If anybody wants to contact me, there is my email address, stephanieM@elsenburg.com. And if you want to look for any of the SmartAgri Plan itself or any of the booklets we have, the other resources on this topic, please go to the website, to the greenagri.org.za website. And we'd love to hear from you, your concerns, your experiences, suggestions for the way forward. Thank you very much.